21st century solutions to heritage at risk. So probably before I start talking about the solutions, we need to start talking about what the problem is. So the number of nationally significant historic buildings at risk is growing in England at the moment. I just wanted to share with you first of all some statistics from Historic England. They publish every year a heritage at risk list of those buildings that are at risk. So they are derelict, often vacant, in need of a new use, and yet it's the type of heritage that we've decided is nationally significant and is worthy of saving. So at the moment we grade our listed buildings grade 1, 2-star and grade 2s, and Historic England collects information on those that are the most significant, so the grade 1s and the 2-stars. And of those, a shocking 45.7% are currently at risk. And the other issue, apart from the condition of these buildings and the need for the new use, is that the cost of repairing these buildings is growing every year. And as resources get ever more scarce and competition for funding gets even higher, the total cost of bringing these buildings back into an economically viable use is growing. So in 2015, what they call the conservation deficit was 475.4 million. And the conservation deficit is the current value of the property plus what it will cost to bring it back into a good state of repair, and then minus what it's going to be worth at the end of it. And in most cases, the cost of bringing it back into a good state of repair far outweighs what it's going to be worth at the end. And this is why there's a huge conservation deficit for us to deal with. As you can see, in 2016, that has grown to 613 million. And new statistics have just been released this week about what's happening in 2017. And really, this is just the tip of the iceberg, because in fact, grade 2 listed buildings account for over 90% of our listed building stock in the country. And you won't be surprised to know that the information that we've got about the condition of those buildings is incredibly sketchy across the country. Apart from in Lincolnshire, because in Lincolnshire you have a heritage trust who galvanised the expertise and enthusiasm of over 400 volunteers over the last few years to go out and have a look at 6,807 listed and unlisted historic buildings across the county. And this is what they found. They found that there are 90 buildings at high risk, and a further 347 are medium risk. So together that accounts for quite a large amount of our listed building stock. So how are we going to cope with those sorts of figures? How are we going to start to address those issues with the sort of lack of resources that we're trying to deal with at the moment? And why should we? I mean, there's a question really here about, if we're not looking after our listed buildings, is there really the need and demand there? And why should we make an effort to look after them? It's my view that architectural heritage is so important to our quality of life. It makes up the character of our towns and villages, and it really speaks about our sense of place and our sense of identity. And those materials and the craftsmanship that have gone into making those buildings, it's just a real expression of the place. And it's a work of art, and it's one that we live with day in, day out, and if we're not careful, we will begin to take for granted. The fact that architectural heritage is important and we need to balance development and moving forward with retaining the character of our historic places is not a new concept. And it started really when the Industrial Revolution was gaining pace in the late 19th century. In 1877, William Morris established the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings, and that was quickly followed in 1896 by the establishment of the National Trust. We know that this is a cause that people still support because the National Trust has just reached 5 million members. We know that there's huge proportions of the population that care about this. We went on through the 20th century establishing specialist groups looking at particular types of buildings, like the Georgian Group and the Victorian Society. And it was in 1947 that we decided to give these buildings legislative protection. In the 1970s, something really interesting started to happen. We started to realise that the types of buildings that the National Trust were caring for, our country houses and our churches and our larger industrial buildings, they weren't the only important buildings. In fact, people cared about the buildings that were special to them, the buildings that held a sort of sense of memory and sense of community in their own places. And so a new movement was formed called the Building Preservation Trust Movement. And in the 1970s, charities were established across the country who started to look at buildings in their own places. And my charity, the Heritage Trust of Lincolnshire, was established in 1988 and registered as a charity in 91. And we've been working ever since to save historic buildings in and around Lincolnshire. The old model was to create a trust that purchased a historic building, took out a loan from the Architectural Heritage Fund, restored the building and sold it on for a profit. As you can imagine, the conservation deficit means that those days are long gone, and we now have to attract quite a significant amount of grant funding in order to take any project forward. As we move through the 21st century and the Heritage Lottery Fund was established, which was established particularly to help these communities who wanted to celebrate their own heritage in their own areas, an interesting thing started to happen. We start to move away from the solutions that were provided by the National Trust and the Churches Conservation Trust. Their work remains very important because they're looking after a huge body of assets. But those people who were really interested in buildings in their own areas started to take matters into their own hands. And we now have quite a large community of smaller local-based trusts who are working very hard in their own areas to save and build buildings that are important to them. In 2016, they launched a Heritage Trust Network, which is all about bringing these people together, sharing expertise, sharing knowledge, and making sure we can support each other on this journey. So I just wanted to give you a few examples of the type of work that's been going on. This is Cromford Mills in Derbyshire, and in 1972 a trust called the Arkwright Society was established to save these buildings. At the time they were in a completely derelict state, and yet they were the first textile industrial mills built in the country by Sir Richard Arkwright in the late 18th century. Hugely significant historic industrial landscape. It had been in use until the 1990s, and there was contamination on the site. They'd been using it to dye textiles, and the contamination on the site was huge. So private developers had moved away from this. There was no profit in converting or saving these buildings. So the trust stepped in, and consequentially they have repaired each and every building on that site, bringing millions of pounds of investment into this small area of Derbyshire through just hard work and dedication. In 2001 it was designated a World Heritage Site, and they've recently won a Europa Nostra award for their work on Building 17. So it just shows you the power of the community when we get together and we want to achieve something. Another building that has recently been purchased by a trust, the Wentworth House Preservation Trust. This is Wentworth House in West Yorkshire. It has the longest Georgian facade, I understand, in Europe. It's a colossal building, and they've started off with repairs to the roof. Now, this building and all of its ancillary buildings, put together, there are 4 acres of roof to repair. So this first phase of work is costing £7 million. They've been assisted by the government in doing that, but in the future, they're on their own. They're having to raise a huge amount of money to repair this really internationally significant building. And they're doing it by galvanising the expertise and the skills that are in the local community. And they're bringing interest and excitement to what's going to be the future for this really significant historic building. So on a smaller scale, Heritage Lincolnshire is doing this work in this county, and we've been working to save the types of historic buildings that we see in our everyday lives. This is 7 to 13 Bridge Street in Horncastle that was saved in 2006. It was in a state of collapse, as you can see there, and the trust stepped in when the council had compulsory purchased the building and raised £1 million for its repair and brought it back into use. It's now thriving as the Sir Joseph Banks Centre, and it's a place where people go to learn, to gain more skills, to have a new experience. It's really made a positive impact on the centre of the town, which is a conservation area too. And again in Boston, this is 116 High Street. This Grade 2 star listed building had been a blight on the area for about 25 years. Again, a private developer had tried to bring a solution for the building, but it failed because of the conservation deficit. And the local community were despairing. They were saying, surely something should be done about this building. The Garfett family established the first private bank in Lincolnshire in this building in 1751. It's absolutely entwined in Boston's rich Georgian past, and yet it was in that state. So Heritage Lincolnshire stepped in and worked with the local community and brought the building back into use, following a campaign that raised £2.4 million. Again, it's been sold on to a local charity called the Lincolnshire Community Foundation, and it's now the offices of Age Concern, and there are new start businesses in the rear yard. And it's really gives some confidence to people along this forgotten high street of Boston that if you do invest in the place, it's going to make a difference. And this is our new project. This is the one we're working on at the moment. This is the old King's Head. It's just down the road from Boston in Curtin. It's a 16th century inn, so it's a coaching inn that's been in community use for about 400 years. People talk about collective memory. It's all embodied there. You have an open day, people bring stories about meeting their friends and family there, meeting their spouses, going and having a drink. There's lots of stories I won't tell you about that went on in that building. But it's a fantastic space. It was closed as a pub in the 1970s and went into private use and just deteriorated to this sort of state. Again, we need to raise about 2.8 million for this project, and we're well on the way. But we're working again with the local community, and they are determined alongside us that we're going to make sure this building lasts into the future. So this is a campaigning call, really. This is all about supporting communities that want to make a difference in their area. I'm working with lots of people that have the kind of ikigai that Justine was talking about earlier. They're determined to make a difference. They're determined to do what they love, and they're passionate about it. And there's a network that you can join if you're interested. You can become a member, you can make a donation, or you can volunteer. But whatever you do, let this be the generation where we don't forget about these vernacular buildings, that we don't focus only on our country houses, and we make sure that for the future generations, these wonderful assets are still there. Thank you.